Welcome to this edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery, brought to you by spiritualteachers.org. I'm your host, Sean Nevins. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Journals of Spiritual Discovery. I have a quick note to let you know that the TAT Foundation's November retreat is coming up soon. And that's going to be November the 11th through the 13th at the TAT Center in North Carolina. The theme is Going Home, which is kind of appropriate for me because it'll be the first time that I've been to a meeting in person since November of 2019. It's also the 50th anniversary of Richard Rose's first public talk. So there's going to be a special session with some of the members from the early days of the group, including my old mentor, Augie Turak, who founded the Self-Knowledge Symposium and was highly influential in starting me on the spiritual search. To find out more about the meeting, go to tatfoundation.org and look for the banner on the home page. This edition of the podcast features Mike Gegenheimer. Mike is the co-author with me of the new book, Passages, an Introduction and Commentary on Richard Rose's Albigen System. Mike also is the president of the TAT Foundation, and he helps lead a local self-inquiry group based in Columbus, Ohio. We had a great discussion ranging from Mike's early days with Richard Rose to his views on rapport and transmission. And I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, Mike, thank you for joining me this month. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for asking me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've had, it's been a while planning this. It seems like we talk about it and then things in life come up and we keep putting it off. But here we are. And I'm ready to jump right in if you're ready.
I'm ready. Yeah, thanks.
One of the questions I usually like to ask people is there's this idea of the born spiritual seeker. And I remember Richard Rose, for example, talking about when he was a little kid, like he was writing Many Are Called, Few Are Chosen, like when he was really little. And I'm curious if for yourself, if you think of yourself as a born seeker or if that's something that came a little later in life.
I don't really see myself as a born seeker. For me, it was always more of a philosophical question. And it was only after I met Rose that the philosophical question turned into a question of self-definition. For me, the little intuitions about life that I had growing up were the spark of curiosity, I guess you'd say. Like I wear glasses, so what was real perception? Was it when my glasses were off or when they were on? And then it was like, well, I'm also seeing everything upside down and my mind's flipping it. And there were questions about color and, what's red is actually everything but red. It's the one thing that's reflected. So there were a lot of little silly beginning questions about that. And, I wondered about personality. You could see people talking nicely on the phone, then they'd hang up and start bitching. And, you saw my friends slowly become hypnotized by girls when they reached a certain age. And I wondered what that was all about. And, it was really more questions about that, about the unknowns. I got into physics and, the basic questions about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and time and space being the same. And gee, what's this unified field theory all about? Things like that. So really it started as a question of questioning about life and the way things didn't seem to be the way they appeared to be.
Is there a point in time that you feel like you switched from questions and wondering about things to the idea that, oh, maybe I could take some action and I could actually discover an answer to these questions?
Well, I think when I was in high school, I thought, I was smart. That was before I got to college and found out how stupid I truly was. But the but the fact was, I thought that if you could understand first principles, everything else would become apparent. Everything would flow from there, kind of like the 2 + 2 = 4 and all else follows line from 1984, the book. So that's when I was thinking there was an answer, but it just wasn't in the realm of a spiritual search. And it was when I met Rose. In fact, the first thing I directly asked him, got up the courage to directly ask him a question, was what is the thing in itself? It was like, how to, experience always just seemed to be one step removed from reality. So the question was, what's the thing in itself? And he said, that's the trick. And that was it. That's all he said. But it was because of him that I started then down a path of realizing the answer was really inside, not outside.
How old were you when you met Rose?
I had just turned 18. It was my freshman year in college. And it turns out, I guess, it was only a month or so after Augie started up the meetings of the Pyramid Zen Society at the University of Pittsburgh. After hearing Rose talk at the Theosophical Society, he had started these meetings up. And one of my friends at school saw a poster, and he and I went down, and he subsequently didn't fire up his interest, but I stuck around.
And that's Augie Turak, right?
Right. He and Ray Sasko are the ones that started that Pyramid Zen group.
Did for you at the time, was Zen something that seemed kind of weird? Because it sounded like you described yourself as more of maybe a scientific, philosophical inquiry. Was Zen sort of an oddball thing, or did that just seem like normal for you? Like, oh yeah, I'll check out Zen.
It was the early 70s, so there was a lot of stuff that people were looking at, and it didn't seem odd. It didn't necessarily seem cool, but I think it was partly that I had heard from one of my friends who came back from his Catholic school one day studying comparative religion, that about the Atman and the Brahman. And when he talked to me about that, I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know why, it just intuitively made a lot of sense. And so, the Zen side of things just didn't seem to be weird, just seemed to be one of those things that was worth looking into.
Compared to what you had been doing for your spiritual path before you met Rose, like how was after Rose compared to before Rose? What was your path like?
Well, that's interesting, because I read his book, the Albigen Papers, is a meditation paper that he wrote eventually, and I began to actually apply what he was talking about. And he was coming up every week to those Pittsburgh meetings, so there was a certain amount of you always got an insight. You're always seeing things about yourself. And I knew he was talking from a perspective that somehow took into account all the intuitions I'd had growing up, and I wanted to know what that was. So I just simply began to apply what he was teaching, and I started, reviewing my past experiences in life that were somewhat traumatic, and looking at the reasons why I did things I did, thought things I thought, said things I said, behaved as I did. It's that can be pretty painful. And as I've kind of found, it was a bit of an emotional pretzel at that point. So, you know, and I began to see changes and become free of these things and not letting them to affect me as they did. And so there was a certain momentum that was building up as a result of doing what he suggested. And we also, there was a wider group of people involved, and there was some, developed some very close friendships, certainly with Frank Mascara and Dan Panshura and some of the other guys in Pittsburgh. But I sat in rapport groups with those guys consistently for several years. And so the value of a group and the development of the sensitivity associated with rapport to me was also something that was validating from what Rose was talking about. To what he taught, and not only by reading his books, but by coming up, speaking to the points that he was trying to make and to pass on to people, that became the foundation of my spiritual search.
You mentioned sitting in rapport. For those people who don't know what you're talking about, can you give what are you talking about? Sit in rapport.
Yeah. Well, sitting in rapport, it's one of two, core techniques that Rose taught in working with others. And in rapport, it's a silent sitting with individuals where you try to feel sort of between the individuals. You might incline your mind towards feeling for the other person's mind, but you don't really focus there, and you don't focus here on yourself, but kind of between. And it's as in a sense, he spoke of the word between-ness. In a sense, it's trying to put your mind in an open place where it can be receptive to impressions. And what I found happen is you could get impressions from people, sometimes unexpected, and you could check them out and you could validate your intuition, which was another key thing that Rose taught, the value of intuition. So in any event, I hope that gives somebody a little bit of an idea. I think the shakers sit in silence and sometimes begin to shake, at least so I've heard. But one of the fellows who checked it out said he felt it was quite similar to a rapport sitting. It's just they have a very religious context in which they explain what happens.
You just play devil's advocate a little bit. Someone might hear what you're saying and process that as, well, they're kind of learning about how to read other people's minds. What's that really doing for you? Is that almost sounds like a parlor trick or something like that? Why was this technique one of the core things that Rose taught?
Yeah, so I think there were two things that were behind it. I think one was the development of intuition. In the exercise, the possibility arrived that you could get insights into other people, insights into yourself. And then he also spoke about the energy of rapport that occurs that would give the opportunity for people who were at a certain point, either questioning or dealing with a trauma, to give them a leap or a shock in their efforts. And then the other side of it, Rose was capable of what in the Zen writings is referred to as transmission of mind. And there's really nothing transmitted, and it's using a word to describe the potential of a student to, in some fashion, pick up on the mind of the teacher and experience what the teacher experienced, or experience what the teacher realized, and be a shortcut to enlightenment. And so part of I see part of rapport and the ability to bring your mind to a point of betweenness and openness was the student meeting the teacher halfway. It enhanced the potential for transmission to occur, for the student to achieve enlightenment. There was, and in the course of Rose's time as a teacher, there was one instance that was fairly dramatic where that happened to a degree with one individual, and it was quite spontaneous and quite by accident. But the person didn't reach, according to him, a full realization, but had quite a leap and an enormous shock that resulted from it.
So this is, it sounded like this was something that you practiced for, I believe you mentioned several years, sitting in rapport with other people. What was what was your time frame of involvement with Rose and his system? How many years were you consider yourself seriously involved with it?
I think I was seriously involved with it for 6.5 years. And then I drifted away. I came back less and less for meetings. And then I ended up getting married, and I was away from active. And I would occasionally come to a meeting, but it was not active at all with that group. I did maintain friendships and met periodically with some of the friends of mine in my hometown of Columbus. And it was kind of like a lifeline to have those friends from the group who'd also left the farm and moved on in life, but to have them to talk to and to meet with. And then around the year 2000, when I was between jobs, I tried to articulate some of the things that I felt were the deepest understandings or realizations I'd had, and the questions and the awareness of those things and how they all tied together was always kind of like the default mode that my mind went to. If I wasn't busy, it would always go back to, what the heck was this? What did it mean? And I found out, sitting there in my mid 40s, that I couldn't articulate it. And I was trying to write it down for my daughter. And so I thought, well, I need to figure this out. And so that's when I kind of picked it up again.
And you mentioned Rose's farm. I've heard it told that you were the first farm manager of Richard Rose's farm. Is this true?
No, it's not really true.
He had a farm legend, huh?
Yeah, it's a rural legend. There you go. So there were 2 roles that Rose asked the guys on the farm to take on in that regard. One was a farm manager, and one was a house manager, and there's a third role that was always a very time-consuming role, which was managing goats that he had on the farm. But I was the house manager, and there was, you got a half a dozen, 20-something guys living in the house and a farmhouse, and there's nobody wants to get stuck doing the same thing all the time. So I basically created a schedule, of which chores people would do, and we rotated it every week, and there'd be and if somebody wasn't doing them, there'd be 5 other guys to remind them, hey, looks like the floor needs to be swept, or you're going to get out and get the water down at the spring this week, or are we all going to go dry? So it was, they were chores like that, just very practical things, but there was no running water there, and it was wood stoves. There was an electric stove and refrigerator and so forth, but it was pretty basic living. And so we divided up the chores, and that's what I did. And I think Chuck Conrad was the farm manager, and did a good job of that. He was very, very capable, handy guy.
And so you were living full time on the farm, or were you going to school and then when you were on break, would you go to the farm? How was that?
Yeah, so I spent 2 summers down there when I was in college, and then when I graduated, I moved to the Wheeling area and took a job, and then I lived on the farm at that point. I stayed with the job only for about a year, and then left and spent the summer out at the farm, which was the summer that we built a large Chautauqua building out there for holding larger gatherings. It was kind of an open air pole barn design. So when the summer was over, I got a job in construction, and then that took me away from the farm. And then I started drifting away after that.
Let me ask you about the building on the farm, because I've heard someone say, and I think it was when I was maybe discussing with them about farm projects and whatnot, and they said something to the effect of, "What is it with these spiritual groups? Seems like they always wind up building stuff. What does that have to do with the spiritual search? Isn't that just a waste of time? Like all this manual labor and these hours spent putting up fences and building buildings and so forth." Looking back upon it, what would you say about your experience with that aspect of being in Rose's group?
Well, it's funny you say that, because it's like, well, you look at Mount Athos, you look at any place. Some of these places are in the most outlandish locations, and they had to build a lot to make them. But the goal was, I believe, was to you can't sit 12 hours a day and end up in a healthy spot. And I think Rose believed that people needed to exercise and needed to be capable people. And it's also so it builds energy when you exercise, and that physical energy. And Rose wrote a whole book about energy, and how to use it in the spiritual search. And that whole effort to do things kept us from puddling, I guess you'd say, and you develop some physical energy, develop some strength as well, and then that energy you can use in your mental effort to if you just sit around, you don't develop that kind of energy. The other thing it was a little bit of a challenge. You bring a bunch of city kids out to a farm, some of them haven't driven too many nails or cut down trees or build anything. And so it's kind of a challenge, and it was hard work, but it also served as group work to actually bring us together in a common effort, even though it was on the physical level. And that translated to friendships and understanding of each other in a different way than we would have had otherwise. It was a more complete understanding of the individual. So, it developed, again, friendships and a certain rapport among people that it built on everything else. And plus, we needed to have a place for people to stay. He had a long-term plan to have a community building, which was ultimately built. He wanted to have a place for people to meet and conduct these Chautauquas, and we probably had, I don't know how many ultimately were there. There were probably 4 to 6 to 8. I don't know over the years how many we actually held, but they had a variety of different speakers on even non-philosophic topics that were not so tangential that he was running a circus, but they were, the things about ESP and people exploring tarot cards and a few other things like that during the Chautauquas, as well as, his own talks about Zen and deeper philosophy.
You mentioned drifting away after a while, after you got this construction job. I mean, was it kind of a slow, less and less, I'm going to meetings or participating in farm activities, or was there something, was there a moment when you thought, this is not for me, or I'm not getting anywhere? Or do you have any sense of what precipitated that drifting away?
I have a definite sense of what precipitated it. I mentioned when we were talking about rapport that it can the energy of rapport can facilitate leaps and shocks and the intuitions you develop around with people. The familiarity of sitting can have a benefit. There were two events that they're not really events, really. They were in one sense. But when I was in Pittsburgh in my senior year, I had what, in retrospect now, I feel was a partial realization. So that was kind of a first shoe to drop. We can talk about that more later if you want. But and then what precipitated leaving the farm for me, or the momentum to leave the farm, was another rapport session. Again, it was with a couple of the guys that I had sat with for years who were also living in the Wheeling area. The best way to describe it is that I had this thought came in. Frank Mascara was sitting right in front of me, and I admired Frank a lot, and he was a very dynamic guy. He'd been in Pittsburgh, he'd been the monitor and so forth, and we had sat for years together. And I remember the thought came to me, Frank knows what's back there. And I had my eyes closed and I opened them up and he was staring right at me. And I asked him later, he said that was something like what was on his mind as well. But the shock made my mind wobble. And if it had this sense that it was on a knife edge and it could fall from that knife edge and I would either die or go insane. So it was an immediate, it was not like a philosophical thing where I might sit back and go, well, no, it was like, this is happening now. And and it was like looking death in the face, and it scared me tremendously. My whole body, my whole mind was just like, live. It was a reaction. It was just, I'm an immature guy. I'm 22 years old. I hadn't been down the road long enough to just say, whatever it is, I accept it. The body and the mind didn't want to accept it. But the imminence of death, what I now realize was only a perception of the relative mind, that scared me. And so I had this openness for about 9 days afterwards. I remember thinking, if Rose comes out here, I'll ask him about it. But I was too afraid to drive in to ask him about it. And he didn't come out in that 9-day period. And it was like well, I have to make that. I look back on it now and it's like, well, I didn't make that commitment to go seek him out. And so it dissipated after about 9 days, but I was like totally open. I had this enormous momentum to go within, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. So in the end, that's kind of what caused me to drift away, this a fear of death, basically.
So it sounds like after that 9-day period where you were really open, like something shifted at that point, and was it that the fear came to the forefront? Not quite following. You had this very fearful experience, yet you had this openness that resulted from it, and then that openness kind of faded or closed. And what were you left with when that openness ended?
I think the memory of the fear, I was left with that. And I don't know if there was a general reluctance or anything. I don't recall that being the case, but I did know that, and I was still there for several months afterwards. And I did eventually ask Rose about it. He said, it's too bad I wasn't there. I might have been able to push you over. And that fear just came roaring back in when he said that. I'm sure that's not what he intended, but nonetheless, I mean, I knew I had to get back to working. I couldn't stay out at the farm. They didn't feel that I could anyway. And so I don't know what shifted, I guess, was a desire, maybe associated with that. I'm kind of speculating now. I don't remember exactly, but that desire to live was there, and it was like I remember there was a desire to kind of go back to a so-called normal life. As anybody that's been down the road a while knows, you can't ignore what you've seen, and I couldn't. And I think I mentioned it was my default mode was to go back to the questions about what does all this mean? How does it all tie together? So nothing like slam shut. It was just like, what's it like to be in normal life? And I was a little bit afraid to dive back in.
Were you getting your law? No, you weren't getting your law degree when you were at Pittsburgh, right?
No, I was. Yeah, that was engineering. I was in engineering school and graduated, and then I practiced as an engineer for about 6 or 7 years before I went to law school.
Yeah. So you mentioned as time went by, wanting to kind of summarize some of these questions for your daughter, and how that was something that precipitated you reconnecting with the TAT group. When you made that reconnection, what were you looking for? What were you hoping to get out of coming back to that TAT group?
I was trying to find out what my mind viewed as experiences at the time, what they meant, and I wasn't really sure where it was going to lead. I was just hoping I'd get an answer. And, and it was amazing to me that the group had continued on. There was a whole generation of people I didn't get to know, like yourself. Maybe met you once or twice along the way at a meeting, but there was a whole generation of seekers I didn't get to know. And there were some new friends. I mean, you put together some great retreats at Lindsley Outdoor Center. I got to know Paul Constant really well at one of those. And then we developed, some other great friends that were new to me. And there was a whole new group of people to work with. And it's the value of a group. I mean, it's funny because Rose had started to decline, and the organization had become exactly what he had hoped it would be. It was open to new people. It was based on friendship. I'm not sure whether your realization preceded that time frame or not, Sean, but it was the matrix of cooperation that he had envisioned, and it was great to see, actually.
I remember thinking over the years, like you were one of the most determined people that I knew, and that you kept coming back, meeting after meeting, and really earnest. That's a word that comes to mind when I think about my impressions of you in those days. But I felt like you were sort of stuck on this idea that you'd had these prior experiences and that you had somehow missed out like that was your chance, and the only way that you were going to get something was to somehow find your way back. What do you think about that? My impression, do you think my impression was off, or do you have a sense of what you were trying to do, what you were looking for those years?
Yeah, it's funny. I think you're right on with that impression. And I think a lot of people, including myself, make that mistake. And, looking back on it, what really happened was that there were moments of realization or partial realization. There were moments of closeness to what is, and it's the mind that gets in the way. So what was real was what those events that I mentioned were, and it was really the mind that was getting in the way. So coming back to your question, your impression was a good one, that I thought somehow getting back to those experiences would be a way of opening the door. And part of my resignation in attitude came from Rose having told us, in order to create a fire under us, I think a little bit, was, you got to find out an answer before you're 30 or when you're in your 30s. And if you don't do it then, well, you're done for. And then it was like, well, you got to find out an answer by the time you're 40, as we got older. So, ultimately, I was in my 60s, and several other people were older as well. I think it's because we continued to fail and try again, and that there was something fundamental about the questions that we didn't let go of.
Do you see a difference between the way that you were seeking when you came back to the TAT group versus the way that you were seeking when you first came to the TAT group?
Yeah, I think I'll do it in the reverse order. When I first started, I was like a little kid trying to play soccer, and Rose was the coach saying, hey, try this over here, and, you might try this technique over here. Here's a good book to read. He knew the playing field, and he could sense kind of where we were, and he was laying out a system at a very high level. It's not a prescriptive system, the Albigen system, but he was laying it out. So it was a learning phase. It was the early stage of seeking. When I came back, I was a little bit more beat up by life, a few more life experiences. I had kids. Time was at more of a premium, and looking ahead, it's like, well, life looks a lot shorter than it did. So there was a feeling that I kept coming back to, that I have to put everything on the table. Nothing can be ignored or protected. I have to put, I feel like I put my relationships in the family a little bit at risk, because I would take off for a weekend or go to a retreat, and instead of being home for something, and I needed to put my beliefs out there, to question them. So it was a deeper commitment, I think, that was different. The second time around, I also had a need, which I never had fulfilled earlier, to read some of the other writings that I found to be very deep and insightful, and they had a much greater impact on me than I ever would have expected. I read Nisargadatta's books, and Ramana Maharshi, and I was just, I felt like I was among old friends when I would read those. It's like, it was just like Rose, there was a depth there that would come out. And and you can sense it. And plus the means of expression was different. So there was a lot of fodder beyond just Rose's teachings when I got back into it.
Gosh, I guess it was, you mentioned the year 2000. How many years was it from then to when you had your final experience, if that's the right word to use for it?
Yeah, well, the realization was in 2019 at the April TAP meeting.
And do you feel like, kind of the perennial question, did you feel like there was something that had shifted in you in the lead up to that realization? Maybe a change in the way that you were proceeding with your search, or an inspiration that had struck you? Was there anything like that, or was it just another year?
No, it was there's some, you hear people say as they get, as they look back on it, they see that there's seriousness that precedes, and that was true for me as well. And people looking back, you'll also hear them say, the universe responds to your commitment. And as odd as that might sound, in ways that we don't anticipate or not, or even don't necessarily want. But if you've made the commitment, it ultimately comes down to, you just don't give a damn about anything else. And I was getting to that point, and in the 6 months leading up to it, I went through some very difficult times at work that were confrontational to my ego, just really pretty awful. And then, I got a lot of tensions from the home life leading up to that. And so I was like, well, it kind of got to that point, you just didn't give a damn anymore. You just wanted to know. And then, the year turned. You set up the April meeting that year in 2019, and we'd been trying to get Paul Hederman there for quite a while. You managed to succeed in getting him there. Bart was a speaker, Paul Resendez, Norio Kushi, and then Paul Constant was leading the Rapports. And when I first saw that come out, I had this inspirational feeling about it. It was like, just a really inspirational feeling about the meeting. And, I don't know that there was any one thing any speaker said there. I had a great conversation with Bart kind of on the side, and enjoyed, meeting Hederman and hearing him pound away at us for a while with selfing. And Norio had a good talk. And one of the things that really was key for me, I think, that weekend was a conversation with Norio. And I told him about the experience I'd had back in Pittsburgh, my last year of college, that I alluded to earlier. And there's a certain feeling that I still had of that. And so when I told him about it, he made a comment that kind of was like a little clue. He didn't know I don't think he was giving me a clue, but he just said, and he started talking to me and he said, well, there's me. We're sitting next to each other and there was a chair in between us. He says, there's me. And then there's you. And then there's between. And I didn't realize he was talking about betweenness, but he was. And he said, and that's a creative space where such things as what happened to me, 40 some years before can happen. And I thought, that's interesting. The next time I have that feeling in a rapport session, I'll follow it. And so the next day, when we sat in the morning, it was a pretty intense sitting. And then that feeling arose and I followed it with absolutely no reservation. Like I said, I was at that point where it's just, I don't give a damn. I'm going to follow that. And then that was the rest was just revealed. It was so you asked about things that led up. I brought you right up to the last thing, but for me, as a result, the rapport sittings they have a great potential for anyone who's a seeker. As you've said yourself in the past, a person can sit in rapport with themselves. And of course, many people whose stories of realization I've heard involve them being by themselves and something that triggers for them. And it's unique to everybody, as you know. But there's something I feel about getting the mind, finding the mind arising in this place of betweenness, this openness, where the only thing that matters is to know or to become, to realize truth for the sake of truth itself. There's nothing to be gained by the individual. There's nothing that you or I or anyone else has that someone else doesn't. It's just you become that. It's the only thing that there is. So you're not really becoming anything. You're just becoming, I guess, your relative mind's becoming aware of it.
And you think that purposefully sitting for rapport can help increase the odds, let's say, of something like that happening?
Yeah, to me, it's the feeling and intuitive side of the search. And I remember Rose ran into a quote, or not necessarily a quote, but some writings by, I think it was D.T. Suzuki, where he talked about, the path of inquiry and the path of meditation, and that there were two schools of Zen that ended up diverging. And there was a school that became all intellectualized and you had the questions and they had the answers and it was all kind of dialectic. And the other side, people just totally focused on meditation. And he always said you have to have a foot in both paths. You have to have feeling and then you have to have reason. And, I think rapport sittings build the intuitive side of the individual and, make you open to seeing things in yourself and others.
And you help facilitate a group out of Columbus nowadays, right? And do you all, I think I've heard that you actually do rapport sittings sometimes online. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's good evidence that people can feel rapport among each other. When you boil it right down, we're not as far apart from each other as what our minds believe we are. And not saying that we have a lot of psychic experiences happening, because that's not the point of it. The point of it is to try to find this feeling of betweenness and openness by working with others and feeling both outward and between. And so it's been I view it as an experiment. And so we've experimented with any number of things to see what would enhance rapport when you're not in the same room. I think that the individual can still, in picking up on their own internal awareness, energy is felt by many of those who sit. When you're in a group in the same room, there's something about being in the same room that's even more powerful. And once in-person meetings started again for the TAP meetings, there were several of us who had been sitting online who sat together. And there was a clear difference, at least for me, in the ease with which I got into rapport with them. And there was a good bit of energy that arose as a result. I have to say, too, there was totally separately, there was another rapport session in the, I don't know, maybe it was 8 or 10 years ago, when we were meeting in Pennsylvania, Penn Scenic View, with one of the folks in the group. I had this sense when they came into the room that it kind of lightened up. And so at the end of a session, we sat together, and it was an extremely deep rapport developed. And all I had to do was remember this person's eyes, and it would bring me right back into it for 6 months afterwards. It was rather unusual. So when you develop this familiarity with your fellow seekers, it builds upon itself. And people who've gone to retreats, and you've been in them as well, when you repeatedly sit in rapport over the course of a weekend or a week, it's very easy to get back into rapport. It's very easy for the energy of rapport, or the energy that you might say is associated with rapport, to become apparent. And it can be helpful to people. It provides, like my own experience has shown me, and as Rose said, it can provide leaps and shocks to people and accelerate their progress.
So for people who are listening to this, who aren't TAT members or don't come to the TAT Center meetings, would they be able to go to your online Columbus meetings, or is that kind of a private group of people who are more familiar with each other?
It's more by invitation. It's more, it wouldn't. Rose always felt that it was appropriate for people that were sympathetic, kind of simpatico with each other, as you might say, or he also said vibrate, kind of the same. And even when we had, 18, 20 members in the Pittsburgh group, he would suggest certain people sit together for that reason. He felt they were more compatible. So, it's more by, it started actually with the suggestion of someone who's not able to sit right now, but she had identified half dozen people that she felt were sensitive enough and began to feel rapport in their online confrontation meetings. And so that was the core group we started with. And then since then, there have been maybe half a dozen others that asked to join, and some people dropped off and some people have joined. So been a changing group, but I guess my answer is, just somebody out of the blue, probably not. I mean, the first step is to get involved in a confrontation group and and then we get to know them. That might be a very appropriate step.
And by getting involved in a confrontation group, do you mean another group that you run, or
anyone.
some of the local groups?
Yeah, any of the local groups. There's people meeting within the broader umbrella of people that are TAP members. There's meetings going on all around the country, probably mostly outside of your group in California, if you're still meeting. Outside of that, it's more east of the Mississippi and up and down the eastern seaboard and down to Florida. But yeah, I mean, there's opportunities to join groups online as well. And many of them are still meeting virtually. Like our group in Ohio turned out to, we only have 2 people in Ohio now. And so there's a core group, but a couple people from California and Maryland and Florida and North Carolina. So we're all scattered around right now. So we've kept it virtual.
Yeah, so people could go to tapfoundation.org and look up the TAP forum link, and that would take them to local group activity and have contact info and whatnot if they wanted to pursue that.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a good way to get involved. And it's kind of a first step, really. See if the approach appeals to their intuition about something to do. Some people come that are just dipping their toe in it for the first time, and others have been around the block so much that they're almost jaded. But they won't quit. But they don't quit. That's the important thing.
What about a person who would like to explore rapport, but doesn't necessarily want to reach out to a TAP group? Maybe they're not group people. Is there anything that they could do? Like, could they form their own little rapport group with some friends? And
Sure,
and if
absolutely.
so, like, is there any guide for how they would do that? Any resource that you could point them to for some helpful clues?
Well, certainly, the working together has gone on for thousands of years. So yeah, they can form a group, and I think Rose talks a little bit about rapport groups in various of his writings. It's in a new book that we've pulled some excerpts out about that, the book Passages that's recently published. The energy papers speak about it to a degree, and so does the psychology of the observer. But it's a meditative technique, and it might sound I don't know what you would say, a little bit impossible, but even if you read Ramana Maharshi's writings and the accounts of people who went to visit him, he taught in silence. And I think a lot of what he did was he would sit and people would get in rapport with him and pick up something of depth that and something that resonated in them that was by doing so. So I think people can do it and try it. I don't know where else to actually look, Sean. I mean, everyone's free to contact us and ask us, what to do, what to try, what to look for. I know that you kind of go into it with a light heart, without expectations, and and hopefully there's people there that like I mentioned, they kind of vibrate at the same frequency. There's nobody that's like uptight about somebody in the group that they're sitting with, and see what happens. I used to think early on, because we sat in Rapport in the Pittsburgh, we might have a little sitting at the very beginning of the meetings. But I always thought, because Rose would come up for some of the Rapport sessions early on, I always thought it had to do with him. And then I realized it's when we met one time when he wasn't around, that it was a group of the monitors from all over Ohio and Pennsylvania all came together in Pittsburgh, and we sat, and it was an incredible session. And I realized that energy is what arises, basically in the context of Christ saying, where two or three or more are gathered, there am I. There's an energy among serious seekers that seems to be attracted to their effort.
Yeah, it was a good list of books that you mentioned, and I'll link to those in the show notes for this podcast episode, so people can go to my website, spiritualteachers.org, and look up the Mike Gegenheimer episode, and they can find links to those resources. And if people wanted to contact you, what's the best way to do that?
Probably through an email that they could find in the TAT forum under local spiritual groups, Columbus, Ohio. There's I think a link to my email address in there. That's
Okay.
Probably the best way.
Got it. Yeah, I'll mention that too in the show notes. So one question I have, and this is kind of this could be a tough question, but in terms of people that you run into these days, seekers that you have conversations with, do you have any thoughts about what are the main obstacles that you see that people are facing?
Well, I could go back through a whole list of things that Rose points out in the Albigen papers, but I don't. He's already written that, and people can look at that. But I think when we have both this confrontation group and that I'm working with, and then the Rapport group, and I think the biggest obstacle is the belief in self. And there's not a whole hell of a lot a person can do about that, but it's the same belief I had, which was that the mind is somehow going to get this, and that the mind is somehow going to figure it out. The mind is somehow going to grasp something and still survive, mind you. It won't have to die or appear to die. I mean, that's a big fear. And some people that've been down the road a bit, they're like, well, I can see this means I'm, so they're identified with the mind, am going to die. And the fact is, you don't. What happens is you are unfooled about the fact that it's a belief that you are this individual, and you really don't exist the way you think you do. So to me, the biggest, at a very high level, it's not something you can do a lot about directly, Because when you see it, you're beyond the mind when it becomes absolutely apparent that you aren't real, you aren't really what you think you are. So you wrote a whole book about what do you do about that problem, and the book's called Subtraction. And there's the effort seems like it has to continually challenge what you're believing, and to a certain degree the way you're acting. And I think as people mature in seeking, what's in front of them is going to be a little different for everybody. But life, if they're committed, life was going to bring up the issues that they need to deal with in the order that they need to deal with them. And I don't understand how that happens, but I look back and I see it. And it's like, I was able to stuff my feelings for 50 years until I had to finally deal with what does it mean to feel? Why don't I feel love like I should? Or think I should? Why is this in the way? But finally it became in the way and I had to deal with it. So, I'm somehow it works that way. I think life becomes our teacher in that sense.
So given that, do you think that there is, looking back, is there anything that you could have done differently, or did things just have to play out the way that they played out?
That's always a kind of a trick question, right? So I think they played out the way they had to play out for this character. I do often wonder if I'd gone to see Rose, what would have happened back in my early 20s. Would have changed the entire course of my life. And I'm not at all bothered by the fact that I have a beautiful family and wonderful kids and all that. So I wouldn't want to change that. So there's despite having taken the long path, as people call it, which was a long and tortured path in a lot of ways, I wouldn't trade what has occurred.
There's this, that reminds me, there's a short story by H.G. Wells, I think, called The Green Door. And, this guy who, moments crop up in his life where he has this vision of something more real than where he is, but he's too busy and, I'll get to that later. So these opportunities pop up and then they disappear. Do you sense or feel like there are moments like that in our lives where we have a choice, and we could, if we were really in connection with what we truly wanted, we would make a different decision than going with whatever is in front of the mind in the moment?
Yes, I do. That story had great meaning to me. It's funny you should mention it. I hadn't thought about it for a while because I felt like I was at that green door and I couldn't find my way back. I mean, so it's an incredible allegory for a few of those things that happened to me. That didn't happen to me, but they happened, I guess you'd say. I don't know. But I mean, it boils down to, in my estimation, to commitment and understanding what you're what's the most important thing, and then being committed to it. And I think some of these things that all these partial realizations or these glimpses, these satoris that were along the way, they were all unexpected, spontaneous things. And it's kind of like death, death creeps up on you, and it's over before you know it. And I say that like I've been there, but the fact is, it's sudden and unexpected, these realizations and these satoris. And if it opens a door and you're committed to it, to seek whatever is being revealed and accept it, then I think you're right. There's moments where you could, you pop through and you find that door never existed. You were always on the other side of the door. You just didn't know it.
Well, we're coming up, I think, on the hour and a half mark. Just a couple questions that I usually ask people. Well, how about what's a book? Is there a particular book that you recommend the most?
It sort of depends on who I'm talking to, but the one I recommend the most tends to be The Psychology of the Observer by Rose, simply because he lays out, and as a companion to that, the meditation papers. Between the two, he lays out the mind and the way that it functions in a way that it's extremely thought-provoking for people and provides enormous amount of fodder for meditation and reflection. And of course, if somebody's interested in his writings, the Albigen Papers is a good, rigorous read. It's a little more difficult for some people to read, but that's why I suggest The Psychology of the Observer at the outset. If it's a more a seeker that's maybe a little further along, I might suggest Nisargadatta's I Am That, and Ramana Maharshi's books. And then if someone is attracted to the sutras, Bart Marshall's Perennial Way is a great translation of some of the ancient sutras, and for me, provided many hours of reflective thinking and feeling for the meaning in them. I've taken that and The Psychology of the Observer all over the world with me when I've traveled. Just as
And how about, I'm always curious if there's a favorite film or perhaps a TV series, something along those lines that you feel touches upon these matters.
I thought about that since you mentioned that you might ask about that. And I don't know that there's anything that's touching on these matters, but the movie Patton is one that I watched many times, and there's something about the attitude and the commitment that George C. Scott portrays Patton as having, and the tough decisions that have to be made, the commitment to go forward despite the army bitching, and in the case of the seeker, egos dying around you, but it's the I don't give a damn kind of attitude. This is what we've got to do. And it's more for the seeker, it's more of the I don't give a damn. This is what I wish to become, the truth. And one of the scenes that always sticks out to me is a tank battle where the tanks his squad of tanks runs out of fuel. They get out beyond where they can be resupplied. They run out of fuel and they run into a panzer division. And it's just like, they don't get out and run. They just turn and start firing. And they end up fighting hand to hand, which reminds me a little bit of Arjuna's conversation with Krishna. I'm not going to kill my brothers, but they were hand to hand at the end. And then they have a little scene where Patton comes up and there's a captain that's there who's managed to survive, and he tells him what happens, and he leans down and kisses him. And it's just like, it doesn't get any tougher than that, and it doesn't get any more appreciative than that. So for some reason, that movie always attracted me, just because of the commitment and that was demonstrated in the movie. And, they were based on real events.
Yeah, thanks for that.
More than you wanted to know.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that film in a long time. And that's a really neat take on that, which I never even considered. I thought you were going to mention the scene where Patton is looking out across the Roman ruins, right? And he's talking about, I think it was the Carthaginians or something like that, in this historic battle, and they're playing this really otherworldly music, like Patton was there in some prior life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I was thinking about that, but I didn't I didn't mention it. But yeah, that was always it's, evidently he didn't know that battlefield was there. He just found it. Guy was that's an evidence of intuition developed from his study of war.
Right. And that I think goes back to one of my pet theories, that you develop intuition in that area upon which you focus. So if your focus is war, then that is where your intuitive leaps occur.
I've seen that in my career, dealing with scientists and engineers who develop an intuition about a technology or materials or something, where without experimentation, they just kind of know what needs to be done. And one example comes to mind. A guy was studying how to mold a certain part, but it kept breaking, and he kept doing it over and over and over again. And then somehow he realized, if he did just the right steps, that this thin foil of metal could be bent and not tear. And it was just like, this is a guy who's so hands-on, he became intuitive about his subject. And I agree with you. It's the same thing, which is why I think, Rose advised us all early on, especially to read different books to get a different perspective on the same thing he was speaking of. And so he talked about The Conquest of Illusion, reading that. He talked about there weren't as many opportunities to read things back in the 70s, but there were some books by Gurdjieff they recommended, just basically because they spoke about working together in a group in the school, and different levels of mankind and seekers. I'm trying to think of some of the others that came up. The Three Pillars of Zen, some people read. And then there's one that deals with the superconciliatory principle, but I can't recall the
Benoit.
Benoit, yes.
Yeah.
Hubert Benoit. Yeah. So, but there's a lot of other writings now that are maybe more digestible than some of those, and more easily understood. Perhaps even your book, Sean, which I found to be a really great a great read for someone who's trying to understand what can you do and what kind of path is it, because it isn't a direct approach at something that you imagine, but rather a subtractive path from those things that you thought you were or that you were attached to that are in your way.
I got to get more guests on here who plug my books. This is a great benefit. I didn't realize. Thank you for that. Well, I mean, I really appreciate the time you've spent with me. Are there, it's a broad question, but is there anything that we haven't touched upon that you feel like you want to mention?
Yeah, there's one thing, and there's this idea of between-ness that Rose writes about, and I alluded to a couple times a partial realization back in my early 20s in Pittsburgh. And to me, when I look back on it, that there was something about the circumstances, and no one set them up. It was entirely unexpected, and but there was a betweenness that occurred. So Dan Panchura and myself had been sitting all through my undergraduate years. This was my senior year, so we'd been sitting in Rapport, and he was one of those guys that kind of I vibrated kind of in the same way. We're totally different guys. I was engineering student, right, and he was kind of like a mill hunk, but he was really smart and really interested and high energy guy. And Rose had made a comment to his girlfriend, who was down in Benwood, where Rose was, and he said, "What do you think he meant by this comment?" And the comment was, there were three of the women in the kitchen, and he came to the doorway and he said, I see three little girls playing, but they don't see me. And so Dan was like, well, what did he mean? And he was so intense on trying to figure this out that it caught fire in me. And it's like, I don't know, what did he mean? And then we started going back and forth, talking. Could it mean this? Could it mean that? Could it mean this? And our minds both kind of went into hyperdrive on this thing. And as it turned out, it was like the only thing we wanted to know was, what did he mean? It was like a koan, right? And then it was the night to sit and report. And, a half dozen other guys wandered in the house, and then we all kind of sat down, and so we had to stop talking. And we both, sat in rapport and tried to do it. It was kind of a dead rapport, but my mind was kind of spinning in the background, even though I was trying to sit in rapport, and I suspect his was too. The moment it was over, we had our awareness became a singular, undifferentiated awareness. And I knew what he knew, and he knew what I knew, and no doubt that. And this was, as I look back on it, there's two things about it. One is that there was this combination of intensity and a desire to know one thing. And then there was this feeling exercise. So we just like suspended it. And then the moment it was over, something happened. I wouldn't begin to explain it I don't know why spontaneous things like this happen, but as I look back on it now, it was what Ramana Maharshi would refer to, at least in my estimation, as the Kevala Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the bucket dipping into the well and then being drawn out again. It was singular, undifferentiated awareness, and that was all that there was. We were both, there was no, this is also, to me, validated, my God, transmission can occur. This is the same thing, only neither of us was realized, so there was nothing to transmit per se. But to that point, we also, the whole world was out there. And so this was kind of like a first shoe to drop, that had we seen the Dan and the belief in Dan, the belief in Mike out there, and something more profound may have resulted. But as it was, the answer we were looking for was made absolutely apparent to us. There was no more question after that. And to me, there's this power of betweenness that can occur at any time when a person has the singular commitment to become, to feel for an answer, to find a resolution of some deep question, or a question that has depth, maybe you might say, and somehow finds the right combination of intensity and feeling. And to me, that's one of the things that, like, a rapport session can be a shortcut as a result. And for me, these leaps and shocks that came from working with others would not have occurred, nor do I think I'd be having this conversation without having worked with a group of people similarly minded over the course of my checkered past. My checkered past as a seeker.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for that.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Sean, to finally get to you. I don't know if you could even say the third time's a charm. It might have been the fourth or fifth time we tried to get together.
Right.
But yeah. But I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing to try to make information available to people that might stir up their thinking, and maybe they'll hear something that could be of value someday.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Mike. So I'll just close by recapping. In case you didn't catch it, Mike Gegenheimer is co-author with Sean Nevins of this amazing book, Passages, an Introduction and Commentary on Richard Rose's Albigen System, which you can pick up on Amazon or wherever you like to buy books. And then Mike also has a group in Columbus, Ohio, and you can find out more about that by going to tapfoundation.org, checking out the TAP forum page, and you can read about the Columbus group and also get Mike's contact info there. So it's been a pleasure, Mike, and maybe we can do this again sometime. It's good talk.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery. I'm your host, Sean Nevins. For more information about today's guest, as well as more interviews, books, and other resources, go to spiritualteachers.org. That's spiritualteachers.org.